Evan Waters, thank you for coming in today. Appreciate it.
Oh, great to be here. Great to be here in the studio.
Yeah, the studio. I'm curious, we were talking a little bit about you being from Pittsburgh, and I've never been to Pittsburgh, even though I'm from Pennsylvania. But if you were to give
the
me...
Appalachian Mountains divided us, and you decided not to cross.
No reason. Never been out there.
It's nice. Yeah, it's a great city.
If you were going to give me a hometown tour, where would you take me? Where were the first places on your list to show off?
I think that a lot of people go on the incline, which takes you to Mount Washington, which overlooks three rivers. So Pittsburgh sits at the confluence of three rivers. And so many people go to the top of one of the surrounding hills to look down to see the two rivers join into the Ohio River, which points west. So a lot of people go there, and they're really cool funiculars that go up to the hillside. And originally people took them to go down to work in the steel mills. And now they're just for tourists, really, taking it up to the hillside so you can see the rivers below. But yeah, it's very pretty.
Yeah.
Yeah. And despite its reputation.
A lot of hiking and stuff out there? Or?
You know what? I wouldn't say in Pittsburgh proper, but maybe in Western PA in general.
Yeah.
I can't say I'm too knowledgeable about the hiking scene in Western PA, but I will say that the city itself is very nice. I think in some ways it's a mirror of Baltimore in that it used to be much more populous, and it's fallen a little bit on harder times, maybe more like the Rust Belt cities like Cleveland, Detroit. So it has some big city qualities, even though now it's a smaller city. Mm-hmm. So I do think it's a nice place to live, grow up, and it has a lot to offer despite its size.
Do you get back there much now, or are you pretty rooted in Baltimore now that you?
I try to. It's not that far away. It's only about 4.5 hours. So if you can survive the turnpike, it's not so bad of a trip, really. Yeah. And as you know, I'm sure about the turnpike.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm surprised you haven't. You know what? I guess I've known a lot of people from Philly and the surrounding areas, and I went to Pitt, so tons of people from eastern part of the state went there as well. Mm-hmm. And I was always surprised to see how few people made the trek over to Pittsburgh.
But
you should try it.
I don't know how far from Philly to Pittsburgh.
It's a couple It's a couple hours.
4, 3?
Probably more than that. The state's a lot longer than you think.
Yeah.
Because what Philly is probably northeast of here almost. Like we're probably closer from Baltimore to Pittsburgh than you are from Philly because of how long the state is.
Right.
Or at least it feels that way. So I'd say it's closer to 5 hours maybe.
Yeah. So you went to a public school there, and you're working at an independent school now.
Right.
Yeah. What are some of the differences, I guess, from your high school experience to what it's like to work at prep school now, or an all-boys school?
Well, as a teacher or as a student, if I put myself in the
maybe just about being here. I don't know. Or both.
It's definitely different. In fact, I was just talking to, I teach some juniors, and I was talking to them about the college experience. And I think we were comparing and contrasting our experiences in schools. And I don't remember, I don't know about you, but I don't remember the crunch for college being this intense.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's a distinction between public and private or more college preparatory environment, but I never remember thinking about it the way that my students think about it.
Yeah.
So I think that either times have changed, and this is just ubiquitous, no matter where you are, or it's a unique quality of a school that's encouraged to prepare you for college.
Right.
In the name. So I don't know if that's true or not, but that it does seem like there's more pressure on students to think about or consider college.
Yeah.
And I don't remember that being the same case when I was in school.
Yeah, it was, I don't know if I had the same situation because I was planning to be recruited for a sport, so I think it was a little bit earlier for me.
Right.
Like my lacrosse recruiting was so early when I was in high school.
That's a completely different world, right?
Yeah, and it was like I was a freshman in high school, and there were like kids my age that were verbally committing to schools when I was a freshman.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I felt the rush and the push for college a little bit at that time.
Yeah.
But it was way different than I think, you're a senior in your senior fall applying to all these schools, writing all these essays. And
Right. Well, yeah. So I played soccer in high school, and they were actively not recruiting me for my soccer play. I have to make sure that no one saw any video of me play soccer if I wanted to get into a school, even if it wasn't for sports. That's how bad I was. But no, so that's true. I think in some ways there's an analogy with intense sport recruitment and the independent school network at a certain level, where there's a lot of concern about colleges, but then also thinking about it earlier and earlier.
yeah,
Like the athletic track in some ways prepares you for thinking about recruitment and retention in a way that an intense independent school will do the same, thinking about college. So yeah, I don't remember the pressure being on me like it is for some of my students, but again, it could be time and it could be the different environment. But I've only taught at the independent level, at the secondary level, pardon me, at independent schools. So I don't have a good point of comparison as a teacher, other than what I would assume is a lot more flexibility in teaching and classes, the kinds of classes you can take and teach. And then also, of course, the resources. That's a big difference from my public school education.
right. How did you know that you wanted to get into teaching, or I guess your line of study first, and then after that teaching probably, right?
Right. So there's sort of two interrelated questions for me. I really like the classics, so the study of the ancient Mediterranean world, especially Greek and Latin. So Greco-Roman antiquity generally. I always liked it. I thought it was fascinating.
Like back in high school,
Oh, yeah.
middle school maybe?
Even earlier.
Wow.
I remember finding in a library an old book that was just a really ancient illustrated history of the ancient world, and it had the Mesopotamians and the Greeks, and I thought it was just fascinating, very evocative. And mythology, like so many, I think for so many people, we find it captivating and different, very different from our own experiences. Like, what is this culture? Why do they worship these gods? It's very weird, but in an arresting way, in a very engaging way. And so the more you're interested in that culture, the more you're sucked into it, the more you feel like, well, I need to know the history of these people, but also I need to know the language and what they wrote. And so that leads you from maybe myth to ancient history to Greek and Latin as languages and literatures. So I fell in really early, surprisingly enough, even though I wasn't studying Latin or Greek really early, like some people can do at independent schools. But I was really fascinated by the myth and the art. And even from elementary school, gosh, I was really interested. I remember a gym teacher, again, this is related to my lack of soccer excellence. I remember a gym teacher saying, "Evan, pay attention to what we're doing. Don't pretend that you're away in ancient Greece."
No way.
Yeah. And at first I was embarrassed, but then I thought, well, he's probably better than this current class.
Yeah.
Wow. No, I remember being teased early on for it. And in some ways, yeah, I do think the more it's strange as you age, you think about how you've come to where you are. And yeah, I think I've always had this interest in the ancient world, even if I couldn't identify in what way I was interested or how I could become interested. But then as you look back, you can see the different steps you take to go from being engaged in myth in the ancient world in general, or maybe seeing like a movie with myth and being really interested, and then taking the steps to learn more. And that leads to a lot more discovery and research in a way that you don't expect. So no, I didn't expect to be studying classics when I was a kid, but I knew what I liked.
Right.
Like the ancient world. I didn't understand it and I wanted to learn more. So it started with that.
Were there opportunities when you were younger in middle or high school to take classes and explore this interest on a deeper level, or was this more of an independent study for you?
At the elementary level, it was, I think, like many kids who like the classics, it's more film and art and just myths in general. So there's a really cool book I remember encountering as a kid, the Delaire's myth book of Greek myths. You should check it out. It's pretty cool. It has really beautiful illustrations, very evocative. So a lot of it was independent, but then later in world cultures in middle school and then some Latin in high school, I was able to explore it a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
But really college, I mean, I was an art kid, and I was just talking to my juniors about this. I was more of an art kid in high school. I never would have thought I would taught Latin. And I liked drawing and art. And then it was only really in college that I realized that you could concentrate and really study the ancient world in a meaningful way. And so that's when it started to come together, and it led to grad school too. So
What were you specifically interested in when you got to college? Did you know like the area of study that you wanted to explore on a deep level, or was that kind of open at first and it took some time to figure out what you wanted to zero in on?
I'm generally interested in the ancient world, but particularly Greek history, I think. Greek and Roman history, and the way that ancient writers express themselves. I always found that really fascinating. I mean, one thing, you pick up a book written by an ancient historian, and they write in a beautiful and compelling way, in a really interesting way. Not that modern historians don't write like this,
Mm-hmm.
but you're confronted with a really different world, and I really like that. I like that it's strange and different, and also quite beautiful and interestingly written in a way that a textbook, say, doesn't reach you.
Yeah. So what are some of those texts that I guess caught your interest early on that, led to like a deeper exploration for you? What were some of those texts that
Definitely Herodotus's histories. If you ever get a chance to read Herodotus, you should. That's what I tell my students, but then they have to, right? Since I teach a Greek and Roman history electives for seniors, I said, you have to read Herodotus. And then I look at the syllabus and I say, you have to read Herodotus.
Yeah, it's right here.
It's required. But no, in general, even if I wasn't teaching these history electives, I would encourage anyone to pick up Herodotus. It's a lot of fun, really fun, which you don't always, or at least some people don't associate with reading history. So
Herodotus, I don't know too much about Herodotus.
He's not by your bedside table.
No,
Your book of
I need
Herodotus. You got to look under.
I need a summary. Who this is.
The father of history. So a Greek historian writing in the 5th century about the famous Persian Wars. So in his preface, he talks about exploring the conflict, answering why the Persians and the Greeks came into conflict for the Greco-Persian Wars, so in the beginning of the 5th century. So he's writing about a generation after that conflict. And he's really interested in tracing the rise of this Persian Empire, which at that time had taken over the world from the Greek point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's very interested in tracing how this, in the one hand, small Mediterranean power, the Greeks, not unified, not strong, not wealthy, were able to successfully resist the global universal empire of the Persians when they invaded. And then on the other hand, Herodotus is interested in culture, in customs, in different peoples, in languages, and religions. And so it's not just a book about a war, it's a book about life and the different lives that you can find throughout the ancient world.
Mm-hmm.
So as part of talking about this war, he also talks about the growth of the Persian Empire and all of the peoples that come into contact with the Persian world. So it's not just a battle or two and understanding tactical positions of different Persian or Greek armies. It's also a description of different cultures. So not only is Herodotus the first historian in some real way, but also the first anthropologist. And so you'll have a whole book about the ancient Egyptians and their customs and how they contrast with the Greek world.
Mm-hmm.
So he's a very universalizing historian in terms of his broad perspective on human nature, human life, the human condition. So I think when you read ancient history, they often have the quality of, in some ways, a novel. And you don't expect that. So I think if people think about ancient history, they don't think about how appealing ancient history can be. So yeah, you read Herodotus and you're taken to a different world. And it's very fun. It's fun in a way that I think other historians are not.
So, what were some of the ways that the Greek culture resisted the Persian Empire that was spreading? And this is at what period of history? What
So
time
this
is
is the fifth. This is the classical period, and really, the Persian Wars inaugurates the classical period in ancient Greece. So the 5th century is when a lot of the stuff that people know about ancient Greece happened. So the Parthenon was constructed.
Mhm.
We have the famous tragic festivals. So the plays of Sophocles and Euripides and Aeschylus are happening in this century. Socrates is kicking around. So all the people that you would know and love from the Greek tradition are really coming in this particular century and after the Persian Wars. So how they resisted were successfully beating back the Persian tide in really famous battles like Thermopylae in the Battle of Salamis, which I think there are recent celebrations of the Battle of Salamis, only recently in Greece. They're sort of still celebrated as these moments in history where Greek unity and Greek freedom is contrasted with this ancient form of tyranny
And
in the Persian world, which
Yeah.
is a simplification, of course, but it's still very celebrated, even in Greece today.
What culturally, what were the ancient? How would you describe the ancient Greeks and kind of what unified their societies and their culture?
Yeah, that's an enormous topic. I could only rely probably on what Herodotus says. So the things that unify the Greeks are common language, so ancient Greek, and common customs and traditions, and shared gods. So they're distinct from other cultures in part because they share in common their way of life and how they communicate with each other. And cultural touchstones could include gods like Zeus, right? And then also cultural artifacts like Homer and that tradition. So they speak the same language and they worship the same gods, and that constructs a kind of community.
And interesting. In the Persian Empire, when did the Persian Empire fall? Like, how long did it take before they?
Well, they kept kicking after they invaded Greece, and they were around the prior century. People might know Cyrus the Great. I mean, it's a great epithet. And Cyrus the Great set up the Persian Empire, which started in southwestern Iran and then spread throughout the known world, at least from the Greek perspective, all the way to India, to the east, and to Egypt and Greece in the west. So an enormous ancient Near Eastern empire. And they have their own rich traditions, but it was very much a monarchy. And Herodotus, I think, was interested in contrasting the monarchy of the Persian world and the democracy of Athens, or the oligarchy that was in Sparta at the time. So it's funny you ask what makes Greeks Greeks. I mean, Herodotus explores both what makes Greeks Greeks, but also what makes them very different. And their political institutions are very different in the Greek world. So Athens, we think of Athens as a democracy, yes, but that was one of hundreds and hundreds of different city-states that had different political arrangements. So there's a lot of disunity too, as well as cultural unity. And so again, that's why in some ways it's unlikely, it seems, to some Greek readers at least, that Persia with its strong king and strong army, like universal army, Herodotus says something like 1 million warriors came from the Persian world to invade Greece. How did this unlikely band of heroes resist and defeat Persia? So one of the answers is maybe there's a political or cultural difference because people in Greece were fighting for liberty, right? And people were being compelled to fight for the king. At least this is how Herodotus phrases it. The picture on the ground historically is probably much more complicated. So, but Herodotus is a great resource for trying to understand some of these cultural attitudes during the Persian Wars in the 5th century, which is really the birth of classical Greece and a lot of the figures that people would, I think, know from ancient history in Greece.
So in the class you teach here at Gilman, you explore Herodotus and what is, I guess, the course trajectory that maybe you start out with Herodotus, and where do you move throughout the year?
Oh, I'm very evil. So I start with Homer, really. I feel like any class on Greek culture or history should start with Homer. And then, yes, we get into Herodotus and Thucydides. So the fall elective is ancient Greece. So we start, I think I describe it as from Agamemnon to Alexander the Great. So roughly from the end of the second millennium BCE to the 4th century BCE. So a lot of long range in time. And then that's the fall ancient Greece class. And then in the spring, it's the Roman Republic. So we start with roughly Romulus and we end with Julius Caesar's assassination. So that's the general chronological trajectory. And then within that, you can select different authors, really cool authors in the ancient world. Herodotus and Thucydides really anchor the Greek class. So the author of the Persian Wars par excellence is Herodotus. And then the author of the Peloponnesian Wars, where Greece is in decline because of civil war, let's just say, by Thucydides. And then in the Roman Republic, it's a lot of investigation of the famous figures in the Republic. So not only Romulus and Remus, but also the birth of the Republic described by the Roman historian Livy, and the Tarquins, and famous figures from the end of the Republic like Cicero and Caesar.
Different emperors.
Yeah, before the imperial period. So that's a great question. So who is the first emperor? That's a big discussion. But maybe Augustus, the Emperor Augustus. So the Roman Republic focuses on that pre-imperial period when the Republic is in operation, which in some ways is oligarchical, but is more representative as a republic than the later empire will be.
So in that course, you start with the Romulus and Remus story. Can you remind me that's the wolf and the twins?
I mean, you got it, right? So we start with the mythic foundations in some ways. So the literature really starts with myth because we don't have a lot of historical accounts, written historical descriptions. Mm-hmm. And then alongside that, we look at the archaeology of Italy and the precursor civilizations of Italy. And then when we get there's more material on the ground archaeologically, and then in terms of historical texts, we move into the Republic where there's more information. And that is described by the historian Livy, who's writing in the time of Augustus, but is describing events from 8 centuries or so before the time of writing. But yes, Romulus and Remus were considered to be historic figures, although they're very much myths, and the famous foundation of Rome between the two.
Where does that myth originate with the she-wolf and the twins?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have no idea. It's like many myths, it's very difficult to trace a trajectory of where they're from.
It's like an oral tradition. It's just been passed down.
Yeah, the genesis of myth is very complex. So you can hear twin stories, say, in a lot of myths throughout the world. In fact, I think the aforementioned Cyrus the Great, this founder of the Persian world, there might have been a traditional story where he was raised by wolves. So this is something I think circulating throughout the world. These myths where people have really unusual birth circumstances that mark them out for greatness. Even something like the Prince and the Pauper, this idea that people can come from very humble circumstances but have noble blood, and it's revealed dramatically over time. Mm-hmm. So you can look at this stuff from a lot of different angles. I mean, we try to look at it as historians, not as people studying myth or literature per se. And so we try to think about, what does the myth of Romulus and Remus tell us about what people thought about their past? And what does it mean that the foundation of Rome was in some ways founded on fratricide and the killing of brother against brother? Mm-hmm. So this like violence and conflict that begins Rome is something that we try to talk about in historic terms throughout the course. So we just had our last discussion about Julius Caesar's assassination. And so we were trying to make comparisons between the way that Rome was born with this King Romulus and the way that the Republic ended with this pseudo-king, this aspiring king, Julius Caesar, for some symmetry. But yeah, myth is fascinating, and you can you can look at it from a number of lenses. The historian, I suppose, might say, it's just
made up.
It's just fictional,
yeah.
so it has no use. Some people think, well, we can maybe take all of the weird elements away, and there's some historical truth. And then there's maybe a cultural historian perspective that says, okay, well, we can't believe this, but people believed it, and therefore it's important. It tells us something about cultural belief and expectation. And so that's sort of the path that I try to take, the path of the cultural historian in my class. So not to discard the myth, but to address it and see what it can tell us about ancient society. So if you have a coin, say, so this is a parallel with the material evidence, if you have a coin that has Romulus and Remus, or a statue that has Romulus and Remus and the so-called Capitoline wolf, what does that say? Like, what is that communicating about your belief in your own culture and your own history and the birth of your country or nation? You know, what does the wolf symbolize?
Right.
If you're the descendants of Romulus and Remus, what does it say that you were raised by wolves? It's very different.
What does that story say about the people and their beliefs?
Oh, you'll have to ask my seniors this question.
What are some of the takes that they have about that?
It's interesting because, well, I think the fratricide, I think I'm really interested in that. That's part. I mean, this is maybe not a wise historical analysis or something that you would say outside the classroom, but there's something baked in. Violence is baked into Roman society, right? And you can see that in the myth of Romulus and Remus in a really interesting way. So maybe the better answer would be compare it with other societies and the way they think about how their foundations work. Mm-hmm. So the ancient Athenians, for example, argue that they were autochthonous, that they were born from the earth. That's one tradition, that the land always belonged to them because they sprung up from it. Whereas the Romans believed that they were in some ways immigrants. They had an immigrant story. And in fact, Romulus and Remus were abandoned to die along the Tiber River. And how they created a city was collecting local ruffians and criminals together as this kind of Robin Hood-like gang in a small village. What does that communicate about your culture, that you have this very different story? You're not claiming that you were always there, but that you were this rough and tumble people from the rustic countryside. You have a hardy constitution, right? So I think those are some arguments to be made about how we can use myth in history, which is just an enormous topic. And I think that if you think about the myth in these terms, I think it's a fun way of trying to explore, or a fun way into thinking about the way the Romans thought about themselves. We're rough, we're tumble, we're warlike. We conquer places, we move into them, as opposed to always staying in the same place. So that might be one way to answer that question. Very difficult question. Good one, though.
Can you, I'm curious a little bit about like slavery in Roman society and maybe how that began or originated and how it played a crucial role in their, I guess, functioning and spread as a society.
Right. So this was a big topic that we just addressed in our Roman history class. It's an enormous topic. It deserves its own course in and of itself. The differences between ancient slavery and modern slavery, and then the role slavery played in ancient society, both Greece and Rome. So slavery, of course, existed well before Rome existed. Ancient slavery was ubiquitous. And it came from perhaps different directions than transatlantic slavery and modern slavery, but it had some similar effects in society. And so a lot of the early slaves that existed in the Greek and Roman world were captured in war. So and Rome is always conquering. And so each city that it takes, it may negotiate some settlement so that people are still okay and can occupy and have some kind of position of authority in their cities. And then some are just reduced, the cities are reduced and everyone enslaved. So slavery becomes, I think, a big deal in Roman society after Greece is conquered. So countless slaves were brought over from the eastern part of the Mediterranean to the western part after the famous Punic Wars. So people might know the Punic Wars with Hannibal crossing the Alps, right? So after that time period, there were tons of war captives brought into Rome. And I think that's when it starts to change Roman society. And you have slaves working throughout both Rome and then the Italian peninsula. And in the imperial period, I think we have a lot of evidence of slavery, slaves' attitudes, and demographic information about slaves through different archaeological materials, where we can get a lot more information about the lives of slaves and how they functioned. But I'm no expert on this stuff. I mean, it's funny. It reminds me of when you're teaching in class and a student asks a question, you go, oh no. This is like either a whole book topic or this is a whole field of study. And ancient slavery is a really robust one with a lot of cool information. And it's an enormous topic.
Yeah, it's hard. I think it's hard anytime when you get a very broad question and you're used to functioning in the nitty gritty and studying the details of it. But for someone like me who knows very little about ancient Greek and Roman societies, the broad questions come to my mind first, and those are usually the most difficult, probably.
Oh, absolutely. In some ways, they're philosophical. So the one you asked before, the interrelationship between myth and history. It's an essential question, but you could spend your whole life trying to come up with an answer. What is ancient slavery? Just to put the adjective ancient on it is to say that it's distinct from modern slavery, and it is in different ways. Mm-hmm. So one way, simple way, and people far more intelligent and knowledgeable than I can answer this more lucidly, but the idea being that in one way, war captives became slaves. It was part of the air that people breathed in the ancient world in many contexts. So slavery was around far before Greco-Roman antiquity and persisted, unfortunately, far long after. But one way was the acquisition, so through war. Slavery was part of life. Another aspect I would say from the Roman context is that manumission was possible. So people did get freed, and they launched very successful careers. And part of this is possible in part because it wasn't as racially motivated or based. So I think the transatlantic slave, there are similarities in the slave experiences, say, of a Frederick Douglass in an American context, which can be productively used to understand slave experience of captivity in the ancient world. But at the same time, it wasn't as racially motivated. So in the example that I used, they were Greeks being enslaved in a Roman context, or people from what is now the modern Ukraine enslaved and brought to Rome. Or when Julius Caesar, who we talked about briefly before, when he invaded Gaul, it said something like 1 million people were either killed or brought into slavery into Rome. So this wasn't racial in that sense, it was more cultural.
Cultural, geographical. Mm-hmm. In what ways?
You're the enemy, or you speak a different language, maybe you have different gods, maybe not. But your status has changed because you lost your freedom in war, or you were later born into it. So that's also part of the slave condition. And there are lots of people who think about this as either a problem. I mean, very few, but there are some philosophers and people who think about this as a problem. But many people just accept it as a fact of life, which is very difficult to get our heads around, I think.
How would a slave gain manumission? Like, is that just a matter of time? Is that the job is done and now you're free? Or how did that work?
All of these questions, I'm waiting for someone more knowledgeable to come in and sit down and answer these questions. So I'll give you a bad one. Well, I mean, so how did a slave get free, or what did a slave feel about his status?
Yeah, like how does a slave get free in ancient Rome?
So in ancient Rome, the manumission process is well, your master has to free you, right? But in some ways, it's economically productive to do that if the slave has some kind of skill. So you can buy your freedom. You can buy your freedom. And that doesn't mean that you're free absolutely. That means that you're a freed person who maybe can participate in politics, but still has to maybe contribute socially or politically to your master. So a concrete example. You're free. Maybe you only have one name, say. Your name is Hercules. You're from Eastern Mediterranean. You're a Greek. And you're freed after serving your master faithfully and maybe doing a trade skill for him and saving up enough money to buy your freedom. Your master allows you to save some money to buy yourself out of debt. Then you take on your master's name as if you're part of his household. So instead of Hercules, you're Hercules Julia, say, I don't know, you're part of Julius Caesar's family. And so you have this association with your master forever after. It's part of your name. So you're part of his wider circle or network of people who depend on him in some ways. So no, you're not, you don't have your body's not under his control like you were when you were a slave, but he is running for office. You better vote for him.
Right.
Or he needs someone to protect him in the Senate because it gets, in the forum, it gets pretty dodgy and people are stabbing each other. You got to be next to him, help him. You got to support. Hey, maybe you're making money now. Maybe you have your own business. Maybe you should help him out and lend him money.
So you're usually tied to your master for forever.
I think so, and I think it's amazing. It's in some ways it's amazing the mobility in the ancient world with some types of slave. And this is not for every slave, right? This is maybe in an ideal situation. If you're working in a mine or you're a prisoner of war, and they put you in a terrible circumstance, your life is short and maybe miserable. But especially I think in an urban context, there's an opportunity maybe for you to learn a trade or to get independence, or at the death of your master to be freed. And then you're part of the social fabric of Roman society. And of course you need some connection. Of course you need a connection to represent you in the court of law, or you need a political person to support. So it's the shadow of slavery, but then it's also a way to plug into Roman society so that you have someone who can support you and give you the influence that they have as a free citizen. So freedmen's histories are really fascinating. And why I use names as an example is that we have tombstones that exist of people who were of a slave status and who became freed and freedmen. And sometimes they're very fancy. I mean, it takes wealth to make this kind of thing and to communicate this. And for some people later in the imperial period, especially, if you were a slave to Augustus, it's a big deal. I mean, you might have a lot of wealth and resources. You might identify with your master.
So it was a source of pride sometimes.
For some people, yeah. And they communicated that on their tombstones, and and there was anxiety about that from people who were free. Your whole life you were free and you were Roman. So what's this socially upwardly mobile? It's a little Great Gatsby-esque where you have people who, because of their connections to the imperial household, even though they're a slave, they're not Roman, they're freed, they're freedmen now. They have all this money and connections, like new money.
Right.
And so that Petronius's Cana Trimalchionis, which I know informed The Great Gatsby, for example, that's the story of a really wealthy former slave who has this fantastic feast and fantastic banquet. And he's an example of bad new money. He's so tasteless.
Yeah.
Everything that he does. He has silly poetry readings and disgusting banquets. He doesn't know what he's doing, but he has more money than anyone because of these connections. And so there's an anxiety, I think, in Roman culture. You can find it in literature in a really interesting way about how are these freedmen so powerful and wealthy? They're corrupting on society. And we see this play out in a lot of other historical situations too, which is really interesting. So ancient slavery is a fascinating topic. I wish I knew more about it because it's really, really, I think it's a growing field. I think people are thinking about slavery more thoughtfully, and a lot more work has been done on it. And it would make a cool class.
Yeah.
So like every question you've asked so far is, oh yeah, that would make a really cool class.
Yeah, 'cause it's so broad, but
well, no, myth and history, ancient slavery, what makes Greek identity even. I think those will all be really cool classes.
Well, here's another one that I think
we
touched on a little bit is just the way that the ancients handled death. We were talking about tombstones, and I don't know much about this topic, but just the concept of death for them, and you know how they treated, I guess, burials and the afterlife and that kind of thing.
Slavery, death. Okay. What's our next topic?
A dense couple courses, couple electives for next year.
Well, yeah, death in the ancient world. That would also be cool. Well, it's for people who work on archaeology. So I'm more interested in literature and historical writing with my interest in classics, but there are a lot of people who do archaeology. And in some ways, it is a meditation on death, because you're looking at tombstones, but you're also looking at the remnants of the past of people long dead and trying to reconstruct their lives. So it's a really interesting question from just an archaeological perspective. But what they thought about death, I guess it depends. It depends on who you were and what gods you worshipped. I think that so for my juniors in one of my advanced Latin classes, so I teach, not in addition to these history electives, I also teach ancient Greek, the language, and Latin classes in the classics department. And so for my juniors, we were just actually, their final project is to recreate a mystery cult and initiate their classmates. No animals were sacrificed in the making of these initiations, don't worry. But was to sort of get inside the head of someone from the ancient world, interested in religion, interested in the afterlife, and it's precisely on this question of death. So if you were maybe a traditional religious practitioner in the ancient world, maybe you worshipped someone like Zeus or Jupiter in a Roman context, maybe you didn't have a clear idea of the afterlife. You knew that it existed. Maybe you would go to the underworld. Maybe there would be a nice part of it for you, but it wasn't. And again, this is a simplification, but it wasn't focused maybe on the afterlife. It was focused, religious practice was focused on what the gods can do for you in the moment, like this worldly benefit. So I make a sacrifice to Jupiter or Apollo, and I do well in battle, or I ace the quiz because I made a sacrifice to Minerva or Athena or something like that. And then maybe I would vow a sacrifice or a temple to gods for this very reason. But the mystery cults are really interesting because they are interested in the afterlife and ensuring that you get a really good one.
And a mystery cult is just a group of people that come together across this belief.
Right. Yeah, they're called cults, but it's a little bit of a misnomer. It's like a religious sect. And it's a mystery because some of their rites are secret. So if you sacrifice in the ancient world, this is a big topic, but generally speaking, you got a temple and you got an altar in front of it, and on that altar is written a god's name, like Athena. You know straight up what you're doing. And all of the rites are outside of the building. So you make a sacrifice to the god and you communicate with them publicly with like a party and a festival. So mystery cults are mysterious, some of them at least, because a lot of the rites are done behind closed doors.
So what kind of things would people sacrifice during these events?
So for it kind of depends on the god you're sacrificing. Sometimes gods prefer particular things. I mean, really deluxe, really classy sacrifices would be cattle because they're expensive. Mm-hmm. And you get the added benefit of having a party afterwards where people can eat meat. Mm-hmm. So that would be a really cool opportunity to have a festival. But a sacrifice could be something as humble as pouring out some water.
Yeah.
It could be pouring out some milk or grain. It could range from something very simple, a prayer or a vow that you do before you cross a stream in the middle of the woods with no one watching. Or it could be something as lavish and big as a public sacrifice of a lot of cattle, and the whole city's involved. So they could really range. So that's the standard Greco-Roman religion say, you know what you get. You got a cool temple, you got a cool altar, it's a public service, everyone's outside, they see what's going on. The mystery cults are distinguished from, they have some hidden knowledge, and you don't know exactly what it is. But once you're initiated, you have that hidden knowledge, and it usually ends up in a good place in the afterlife. And so connects to myth. So the people in myth who went to the underworld and came back, they have this special knowledge. And so figures like Orpheus get associated with mystery cults. So one mystery cult would be Orphism from the ancient world. Or the juniors just presented today on Isis. And Isis and Osiris are underworld deities in Egyptian myth, and they have knowledge of the underworld. Mm-hmm. So these would be examples so if you're part of this mystery religion, let's call it a religion so we don't have to worry about the baggage of the term cult, then you do have a real sense that death is just the beginning. And maybe for more traditional Greco-Roman religion, death is a part of life. It's inescapable, it's important, but it's not an emphasis of religious practice. So maybe a simplification of a very complex topic.
Interesting.
So death, life, taxes is next. I can't answer on that.
Well, that's fascinating. There's a lot to go through there. We can have a couple different courses.
Oh yeah, that's terrible. I shouldn't, because I'll be competing with myself, right? I think so. Yeah.
How many courses do you teach here? 3 or 4?
So one's a mixed class. It's like a one-room schoolhouse for ancient Greek. And then the 2 electives, but the electives are fall, spring. And then 2 Latin classes. So I teach freshmen honors Latin, and then juniors Latin 4. And I think that's all of it. So lots of stuff. That's so to return to one of your earliest questions. I mean, I would have loved. I mean, I guess this is sort of this is maybe self-aggrandizing, but I would have loved to take these classes as a kid.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that's not true, but maybe that's not.
I mean, it sounds like it was true if your gym teacher was telling you to stop thinking about the ancient world.
Well, no,
third grade.
You raised a good point. Yeah. Well, I probably shouldn't have worn a toga that day, but I would say that I'd say that there was nothing like this when I was. The idea that I could teach ancient Greek and Latin in history classes was so attractive to me, and that students would be interested in them, and so that's a really magnificent part of Gilman, and I don't know how many places you can honestly say to have that kind of diversity in teaching, and then for you too, and for other teachers to be able to create your own class and your own curriculum. So I could think of 100 electives. I mean, I'd be competing with myself. But I'm sure that you could too, right?
Yeah.
With your teaching. And so it's the same for me. I mean, the ancient novel. I mean, ancient science fiction. It exists. Stuff like that exists. And classics, maybe not a lot of people know about all the stuff, but they're really cool texts, and they can make really interesting classes. So what classes have you designed?
So I have 2 senior electives that I teach for English. The first is a leadership character in literature class, which I kind of took from Bart Griffith, who was here before. He actually is at Shadyside Academy in Pittsburgh now.
Yes.
He's the head of school there. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, he's there.
Great school.
We need to get him on this podcast because he's a great guy. But he taught a leadership and character and lit class that I took from him when he left.
Cool.
And then I teach a great short fiction class in the spring for seniors. We just had our last class of the year today.
How did that go?
It was good. I mean, yeah, time to move on. Sad, but I think the seniors they've got one more day left. They're itching to get out of here.
Are you saying that they're not the most engaged?
Yeah. No, senioritis through the roof.
So again, much like mystery cult people, they're thinking about the next life, their college life, their summer life, and not this moment.
Yeah.
I think that's probably fair to say. What stuff do you read in your leadership?
This was my first year really in person teaching them because last year was virtual.
Right.
But we read a bunch of different texts. We read a play called All My Sons by Arthur Miller. Mm-hmm. We read Siddhartha. Siddhartha. Read a pretty heavy book that I was reading on my own, and that's another benefit to teaching here at Gilman is you can design your curriculum, and even when it's already designed, you can kind of add a few things.
It's such a gift. Yeah. I
was reading this book called When Breath Becomes Air, and I found it really powerful in terms of, I don't know, just moving me and making me think about certain things. It's about this doctor who's in his 3rd year of, I guess he's becoming a doctor. He's in his 3rd year of residency, and he gets like terminal cancer, and he wanted to write a book in the last year, I guess, of his life, and very powerful story about just his, I guess, career up until that point and his life, and it's called When Breath Becomes Air. So that worked really well in that character class because it made him think about some of those bigger, deeper questions. So yeah, how do you define character in your class then? I think it's really an exploration. I mean, we talk about a lot of different, I guess. I'm going to turn the tables. How do you define character? Yeah, it's a tough one. A lot of different moral qualities. I think we talk about like Gilman's mission and the Gilman Five a bit. Yeah. No. Yeah.
I've always thought about how to actually incorporate that in class, especially with I know it's lame, but ancient philosophy. Like
Yeah.
in thinking about your class, like starting with a Platonic dialogue on like a virtue would be kind of cool.
Right.
In the same with virtue ethics, I think that's becoming more and more popular. It seems like you can't turn on your computer without some weird Stoic podcast coming up making like a recommendation about virtue. But
Like, yeah, Ryan Holiday, do you know him?
Yeah.
He's on my he's a newsletter, and he writes a lot about the virtues and the emperors and
yeah. No, Stoicism is hot. That's a very Roman thing. But no, I think a virtue ethics class or a class that uses at least the ancient conceptions of different virtues as a starting place would be really cool. I think for a boys' school in particular, I've always thought about that.
Mm-hmm.
So what does Plato have to say? And usually the dialogues are great because they are very open-ended. They don't have a neat resolution or definition. So like you were talking about character, it's an exploration. It's precisely the way that Platonic dialogues often work,
Right.
as an exploration. So it's a great way to start thinking about things like that.
Yeah.
But I have to stop potential electives, creating them,
Yeah.
because then you have to teach them now.
Yeah, so I think that's what I want for the classes, for the students to kind of think about their character traits and what is important to them and the virtues they want to strive for in life. I
That's
think
really cool.
That's part of it. And
Yeah.
you get those questions through reading different texts and talking. And, I think that's really what it is an exploration. Especially, I think it's good in their senior year. I would have maybe preferred that class to be in the spring because it's a little bit more, I guess, central to what they're thinking about right now as they're moving on. But that was a great fall class.
But you had nothing like these classes senior year when you were in high school, right?
No, I don't think so. I don't remember too many electives. There's so many different classes you can take here.
No, it's that diversity. I think that's really cool, and it makes it attractive as a teacher, and I hope as a student, to have different options, because in some ways structurally it prepares you for college too.
Right.
And having choice and being able to follow your passions in a way that engages you.
So your first year here at Gilman, sounds like you enjoy the open-endedness of the course curriculum making and
Dangerous to have open-ended course curriculum.
It sounds like
for
you
me.
enjoy your classes.
Oh yeah, it's great.
What
It's
else
great.
do you like about this first year? What has gone well for you so far?
It's nice to get familiar with the students. I mean, every school is different and functions differently, and every school has a different schedule and a different culture. And so it's really been nice to finally hang out with students again, because the online teaching, I'm sure, wasn't ideal for anyone. And so I think in addition to the diversity of teaching, being able to get to know students is great. And just like I'm sure that you enjoy in secondary school teaching, is that you can see them develop. And I know the students, and I'll be able to learn more about them next year, and to be able to see that longer scale of time is a gift as well.
Right.
So I really like that. And I can see it here clearly, that both of the culture and the students that I like, how that will grow in time.
Yeah.
So, but a lot of things I like. I mean, yeah, Gilman's great.
Yeah.
I'm a fan.
Yeah. Good. What were you doing before coming here? Were you teaching last year virtually?
Yes, I was teaching at Catholic University of America. So I was teaching college students, and yes, it was all Zoom all the time. So
In a college class, how many were in your Zoom?
Oh gosh,
Zoom
what a
courses?
great question. I don't. You know what? It seems like a lifetime ago. It's like you might as well be asking me about.
It does. Isn't it strange?
You might as well be asking me about the Persian Wars. I think I probably know more about that than my last year of teaching online. It was a fugue state. It would range from maybe 10 to 15 students to over 20, I think. I could be wrong about that. Again, it was the before time, so I don't know. But Zoom, engaging people on Zoom, I never figured out exactly how to do that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if anyone has.
Yeah. I mean, I think I needed more bells and whistles.
Yeah. More props.
You know, one thing that I don't think really did make a difference, but I felt that it did in my mind, which may be of value, is that I always tried to stand when I was teaching, as if I was still in a classroom rather than sit. So I felt like maybe it was just a trick to wake myself up, but as if I was, walking around, pacing in class. I tried to always, no matter what, stand, which required not wearing pajamas, but I think that that's a sacrifice I was willing to make.
What do you think that did? I mean, wakes yourself up a little bit, but...
Oh, yeah, it doesn't, it sounds like a TED Talk. No, it wasn't a power pose or anything. I think it just woke me up, and to me, it felt more like a classroom to stand and talk to people, like you would in front of a classroom.
Yeah.
And so for me, it kind of recreated that feeling physiologically of being in class. I mean, it was ultimately, I don't think it was a good replacement.
Yeah.
I don't think that students at home had a desk that they sat in to recreate the experience virtually, but it was good. It felt like it was not sitting in a meeting.
Yeah. Right.
It felt more real, but maybe that was just an illusion.
What would have been some of the differences that you've noticed between teaching college students in previous years and teaching at an independent school with high school boys?
Yeah, it's funny. I taught in another independent school as well and in college. And it's an interesting question because sometimes there's no difference at all. I think that freshmen in college often are very much like high school juniors or seniors, that it really depends on the institution and the class. Obviously, I think that some students at the college level, they're definitely there to get a credit. They're just there so they don't get fined. And you can really sense that. And a lot of, I think this is probably the case for high school students too, that freshmen, sophomores may be more bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. And freshmen, sophomores in college also feel that way, that they haven't become jaded juniors. Mm-hmm. So, it really depends on the class. Some of them remind me of some of my best classes remind me of my best college students. So in some ways, the class is the class. And I've taught a range of ages too. So some of the classes that I taught at Catholic, like Latin or Greek or something like that, it will be kids like an undergrad, and then it will be like older monks or something. And they come with very different experiences, life experiences and backgrounds, but we're all students. We're all on the path and trying to figure it out. So the more that I compare the two in my mind, the more similarities I see.
Older monks at Catholic University?
Oh, yeah.
Really?
Catholic University's got they've got lots of different programs for training priests. So you have different monastic orders and different degrees that you can take within the Catholic Church that are required to perform services and climb the ranks in the Catholic Church. I'm not a Catholic, so I'm not as familiar with that tradition. But it's wild.
Wow.
It's wild to have a Zoom class, and you have people Zooming in from all over the world and from all different kinds of ages. So when I teach summer classes at Catholic, you have an undergrad or a high school student trying to read the Aeneid in Latin, and then you have an older student or a monk who is Zooming in from across the world trying to get their Latin requirements to get their degree to do the pastoral work that they're doing.
Wow.
So it's really fascinating. It was a really cool experience.
Did you feel like you could get some interesting back and forth or conversation over Zoom and expose some of those different perspectives, or was it more lecture based when you were, I guess, teaching online?
It was challenging. It was really challenging to get people, I think, involved in discussion. That was the thing that I found the most difficult. I think when the pandemic started, that first transition from in-person to online, however many years ago that was, it feels like a lifetime ago, I was doing a discussion class. And I think managing a discussion is the most difficult kind of teaching that I've ever done. And I've done
on Zoom?
Well, just in general.
Really?
For years. I've always had a discussion, something, for years and years and years.
Yeah.
And managing that and doing it well, I find the most challenging of any kind of teaching. Because I can bore you about the Persian Wars, as you well know by now, for any length of time. So that's like the lecture part is easy, but getting students to talk to each other, cultivating discussion, that's the hardest thing. Mm-hmm. And so I found that difficult in person, let alone on Zoom.
Right.
So trying to come up with strategies to pit students against each other in a slightly Machiavellian fashion is what I ended up doing.
Yeah.
I would say, so, Samantha, you disagree with John in this respect
Yeah.
and see what they do. So,
Yeah.
which is a sort of a cheap ploy, but I did it all the time.
I had to do this project for the master's program that I did when I first came to Gilman a couple of years ago. And my like year-long question or project that I wanted to work on was creating an environment that made everyone feel comfortable and engaged in my classroom. Pretty like open-ended topic, but I chose it because coming here, I was pretty shocked at like the rigidness of having the boys and the girls in the same classroom. And it's kind of awkward at times, my first class, because they were all nervous. No one wanted to speak. And I didn't feel like I was that good at making it like a loose, comfortable environment. So I wanted to focus on that.
Did you figure it out?
Well, it depends on the class. It depends on the
Write it down for
chemistry.
me and slide it across the table. Just write it down for me. And I like that.
I think competition though is one of the I guess components that I figured out. Like at the beginning of the year, I try to have some competitive games, or especially for high schoolers,
right,
who are competitive. They're trying to get to the best colleges and get the best grades, and what we were talking about earlier. Like the boys and the girls dynamic in my classes, making it somewhat competitive at the start, I think loosens everything up for the rest of the year, and that's kind of what you're doing with the. Samantha, you disagree with this. You're kind of pitting them against each other a little bit.
I should say, too, that on all of my classes, they happen to be co-ed right now. So that's a little bit different than some other teachers' experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that changes the classroom dynamic or not for discussion, if people are more bashful or less bashful as a result.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. That could be another variable. But yeah, staging debates and disagreement, kind of sowing seeds of discord. That's not how I phrase it, of course.
Right.
That can be productive conflict. That's how I should say.
Just get some emotional appeal, I guess that's what it does. Is
Yeah. No, well, to be invested in a position, even arbitrarily, by knowing what someone has written. Like pre-writing for discussion, I think has been very useful in staging these encounters in class.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't always do it well. But when it works quite nicely to mitigate some of the challenge of getting people to speak, and about something that might be difficult, and including these like cosmic questions that you're asking.
Right.
I mean, that's a lot. That's a lot to take in. But if you've done at least some reflection, and for me, trying to get students to engage with primary sources, ancient sources. So maybe you don't know about what makes Greek identity. I mean, I don't. But maybe Herodotus does, and you can appeal to him as a source.
Mm-hmm.
That would be one example. And that applies to literature classes as well, which I think is useful. But no, if you figured it out, let me know. At least send me an email or something. I'd like to figure that out.
Yeah, I'll print something out for you. Print out a pamphlet.
More experienced teachers could educate me about that.
So a couple more questions I have for you. The first is, in your line of expertise in ancient Greek and Roman studies, is there something that you're focused on right now that you enjoy learning about on your own that other people listening to this might want to check out or look into a little bit more and have a conversation with you about? And then the final question is about your book recommendation here.
Wow, that's a great question. I don't know. I mean, I'm always interested in different aspects of the ancient world, and some of them aren't even Greco-Roman. So you think, oh, classics, you like the latest classics books. But I love just random books on aspects of ancient culture. So there are books that I've encountered recently on cuneiform and Sanskrit and the ancient classical traditions of other peoples and other cultures. And so, yeah, if anyone wants to talk about what constitutes the classics in these other traditions, that I would love to learn more about that. And I have some book recommendations there. But yeah, I think people who like classics, people who do classical languages, are always interested in other languages too.
Mm-hmm.
So Sanskrit would be a great example of a rich ancient language from another tradition that there are parallels with, say, ancient Greek, but has a really rich, fulsome vocabulary, language, syntax, culture. And so just reading about ancient India has been really rewarding. And so one of the challenges is, what is classics? Like, do you study Moby Dick, or do you like classical music? You must be really into Bach. Okay, well, Classics is not the best term for what we study. The ancient literature, history, and art of the Mediterranean. But it is kind of a useful category to think, well, what do cultures think as elevated in status in all of these different traditions? So classics more broadly is thinking about what survives the test of time and by what means in these different cultures. So I'm becoming more and more interested in this, maybe a maybe more multicultural or global sense of classics. So what's the classics in insert whatever culture or country,
Mm-hmm.
in China, in India,
And why?
and why?
Yeah.
So I would love, I think one of the, don't hold me to this, another elective would be and I've taught a class like this before on comparative mythology. So not just the Greeks and Romans, but Norse mythology and Mesopotamian mythology and Chinese mythology, and trying to draw connections between them. So if anyone's interested in what is maybe not Greco-Roman antiquity even, but what is antiquity largely conceived, I'd love to be educated and to talk to them about it, because hopefully that stuff is exactly the kind of stuff that can inform future teaching and in the department in general. So classics broadly conceived. It's a really cool idea.
Classics broadly conceived, another broad podcast question.
Yes, absolutely no short, simple questions.
Well, I'll do my research and maybe I'll have some more questions for you on the next episode. And then
I need to get more educated.
What is your book recommendation here?
Oh, okay. So book plug. This is I'm recommending The Periodic Table by Primo Levi. So
you mind holding it up to the camera?
Should I hold it up to this camera here?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. Whoa.
Nice.
I haven't done enough book plugs.
Okay.
Should have brought my Herodotus too. I could have really mimed it at the appropriate time.
Plug that in there on the video. Cesare can make that happen. What is this book?
So I really enjoy 20th century Italian literature, and so Primo Levi is very famous as a writer, primarily of the Holocaust. And so he had a very famous work. I think that it was published under the title in English, "A Survival in Auschwitz."
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really beautiful account of a Italian Jew survival from the Holocaust and his experiences in a year surviving Auschwitz. So it's a very powerful book. I would encourage anyone to read that book. But he also is a trained chemist. In fact, it's one of the reasons why he was able to survive in Auschwitz was that he had this specialized training. And so they assigned him special tasks. And so part of his life, though, was just working in a paint factory and doing like chemistry stuff. And so also becoming a writer in part by surviving the Holocaust, he decided to reflect on his experiences and put it into writing. And I would say so in addition to that book, The Periodic Table is his reflection of science and poetry. Like the periodic table of elements as a way of thinking about his own life and the poetry of science. So I know nothing about chemistry. It was not one of my it was like soccer in high school. It wasn't one of my strong suits. But the way he writes about science makes it beautiful. It's like this really interesting marriage of science and poetry. Ooh. So it's a prose account. It's a series of short stories based on his life, including his experiences in the death camps, but then also as a chemist. And it's his reflection of these different experiences studying chemistry in school, using chemistry in his day-to-day life, and reflections on his own life. And so there are a series of short stories named after each of the elements.
Wow, that sounds interesting.
Yeah, I think it starts with argon. It starts with the noble gases and ends in carbon, and each is a short reflection. And they're really wonderful. And again, I don't know anything about chemistry, but the way he describes things, the way he describes technology and the chemical process is really beautiful and captivating to me. Wow. And of course, his personal life and his other books are wonderful too.
Excellent.
So check out Primo Levi.
The Periodic Table.
The Periodic Table.
Awesome. Thank you very much for the rec. And Evan, thank you very much for coming on the podcast today.
Glad to be here in the studio.
Yeah, thank you.